The morning sun filtered through the blinds of the compact apartment in Hyundai, painting golden streaks across the minimalist decor. Gina stood at the kitchen counter, pouring warm barley tea into 2 ceramic cups. Her movements were precise, almost ritualistic, shaped by years of habit and unspoken expectations. The scent of toasted grains rose into the air as she placed a cup on the small dining table where Min-jun, her husband, sat reading a newspaper. "You've got class this morning, right?" she asked, her voice calm and even, like a stream running over smooth stones. Min-jun looked up with a gentle smile. "Yes, seminar on post-colonial narratives. I'll be back before 6 o'clock. Want me to bring something for dinner?" She shook her head, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "No need. I'll cook." Their routine was seamless. No raised voices, no forgotten anniversaries, no nights out without explanations. To the neighbors and friends, they were the perfect couple. Soft-spoken, cultured, and impossibly courteous. But beneath that porcelain veneer, Gina lived with a constant, quiet tension. It wasn't fear exactly. It was more like an invisible pressure on her chest, the sense that every movement, every word, every expression had to be curated. Her mother, Mi-kyung, had recently moved back to Busan after more than a decade in Daegu. It was supposedly to be closer to her daughters now that she had retired from public service. Gina had smiled and welcomed her. She had even helped Mi-kyung find an apartment nearby, just 5 blocks away from hers. But she hadn't forgotten the way her mother's presence once ruled her life. Mi-kyung was meticulous, immaculately dressed, and deeply invested in appearances. She had been a single mother most of her life, and with no husband to validate her social worth, she had built her image around being the mother of the perfect daughter. Gina had been raised not just to succeed, but to reflect her mother's resilience and ambition. Every trophy, every academic award, every carefully chosen word in public had been another stone in the monument Mi-kyung built to herself. Now, as a literary translator working with prestigious publishing houses, Gina had what others might call an enviable life. She lived in a city she loved, had a supportive husband, and enjoyed the intellectual solitude of her profession. And yet, as she walked to her office that morning, past the cafes and fruit stalls of the coastal neighborhood, a question she couldn't silence lingered at the back of her mind. Who was she when no one was watching? Later that afternoon, she met her mother for lunch at a quiet restaurant that served traditional temple food. Mi-kyung was already seated, wearing a cream-colored blouse and a pearl necklace, her expression unreadable. "You're 5 minutes late," she said, not looking up from her phone. "I had to send off a manuscript," Gina replied, sitting down. "How are you feeling today?" "Busy," her mother said flatly. "The neighborhood committee asked me to organize the cultural week." Of course they had. Mi-kyung had always found ways to insert herself into leadership roles, even in retirement. She thrived on control and the admiration it brought her. They ate in near silence. Mi-kyung occasionally asked about Min-jun, his lectures, his health, his family. But she never asked about Gina's feelings or ambitions. That had never been part of their dynamic. Gina had learned from a young age that her value lay not in being herself, but in being whatever her mother needed her to be. After lunch, Gina returned home alone. Min-jun wouldn't be back until the evening. The apartment was tidy, the air lightly scented by the diffuser in the living room. She opened her laptop to review a new manuscript, but the words blurred on the screen. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, unmoving. For a moment, she thought about calling her younger sister, Yoonji, but they had grown apart over the years. Yoonji had left for Canada at 20, eager to escape their mother's grip, and never looked back. Gina had been the one who stayed, who bore the burden of being the responsible daughter. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. She opened the door to find Mi-kyung standing there, holding a small Tupperware container. "I made japchae," her mother said. "I had too much. You can have some." Gina took the container with a smile. "Thank you." Mi-kyung's eyes scanned the apartment, as if silently assessing it. "You should add more lighting in the hallway. It feels dark." "I'll think about it. I can bring over a lamp tomorrow." "That's not necessary." Mi-kyung nodded, but didn't leave. She stepped inside without asking, walked to the kitchen and began rearranging a few things. Gina watched her silently, teeth pressed together behind her lips. When her mother finally left, the apartment felt colder than before. Gina placed the container of japchae in the refrigerator, then sat on the couch and stared at the blank television screen. Her phone buzzed. A message from Min Jun. "I'll be late today. Faculty meeting ran long. Love you." She replied with a simple, "Okay. Take care," but inside something churned. It was a strange kind of unease. Not a sharp alarm, but the slow creeping certainty that the order she had built her life around wasn't as stable as she thought. That night, as she lay in bed beside her sleeping husband, Gina stared at the ceiling. Her eyes were wide open, her breath steady. She thought about her life, the choices she made, the woman she had become, the rules she never dared to break. And for the first time in a long while, she wondered if she was truly living her life or just surviving within it. She closed her eyes and imagined what it would feel like to wake up and not be the perfect daughter anymore. Not the perfect anything, just herself. The rain was falling lightly over Busan when Gina stepped off the train. Her return from Seoul had been unplanned. A last-minute cancellation of the final meeting of her translation trip had allowed her to catch an earlier train back home. The platform was quieter than usual for a weekday evening, and the rhythmic tapping of the raindrops against the metal roof seemed to muffle the noise of the city. She didn't call Min Jun to let him know she was coming. There was something almost satisfying about the spontaneity of it, a small rebellion against the structure she had always upheld. She took a cab instead of the usual subway, watching familiar streets flash past the window as her reflection stared back at her, unreadable. It was just after 7 o'clock when she entered the apartment. The hallway light was off, but the ductor was unlocked, something Min Jun never forgot to do when he was alone. She slipped off her shoes, careful not to make a sound, and noticed that only one other pair of shoes was visible, her mother's. Gina stood still for a moment, her breath caught somewhere between her ribs and her throat. The apartment was quiet, but not silent. Soft sounds drifted down the corridor from the guest bedroom. A voice, a laugh, then something else, more hushed, more intimate. A whisper. She didn't want to believe what she was hearing. Her body moved on its own, silently down the hall, past the framed photo of their wedding day, past the bookcase that held her translations. Her hand reached for the doorknob of the guest room. The door opened just slightly, no more than a crack, but it was enough. Inside, the glow of a bedside lamp lit the room in amber. Min Jun was there, his back to her, seated at the edge of the bed. Mi Kyung sat beside him, her hand resting on his knee. Their heads were close together. She said something that made him smile. He leaned in, pressed his forehead against hers, and for one horrifying second, Gina thought she would scream. But she didn't. She closed the door just as silently as she had opened it, her fingers trembling. The hallway seemed longer now, her steps heavier. She walked back to the entryway, picked up her bag, and slipped her shoes back on. Her heart beat so loud she thought they might hear it, but they didn't. There were no dramatic confrontations, no broken vases or shouted accusations. Gina didn't cry. She didn't even blink as she pressed the elevator button and waited. Her gaze locked on the closed door of her own home. By the time the elevator doors opened, her decision was already made. Outside, the rain had eased into a mist. She walked down the street, not knowing where she was going. Her phone buzzed in, her bag, but she didn't look. She kept walking past cafes, past shops, past a world that suddenly felt foreign. Her mind replayed the scene like a looping film, every detail vivid, unyielding. She found herself at a small 24-hour diner near the harbor, one she used to visit during her university days. The place was nearly empty. She took a seat by the window, ordered a cup of tea, and sat there for hours, watching the fog roll in from the sea. When she finally checked her phone, there were no messages from Min Jun, none from her mother. The silence was louder than anything they could have said. That night, Gina booked a hotel room under a different name. The receptionist didn't ask questions. She slept with the television on, not watching, just needing the noise to fill the void that had opened inside her. In the morning, she made a list. It wasn't a list of revenge or plans. It was a list of severances. She deleted her social media accounts, shut down her messaging apps, and called her editor to say she needed time off for personal reasons. Then she transferred money into a secondary account, enough to last her a while, and booked a one-way ticket out of the city. No tears, no explanations. She wasn't running from them. She was running toward herself. In the days that followed, Gina became invisible. A woman with no history, no future plans, no one to answer to. She bought a simple phone with no internet and kept it turned off. She threw away her wedding ring in a donation bin. She didn't even feel the weight of it leave her finger. Mi Kyung called several times, then stopped. Min Jun left. A voicemail or two, sounding more confused than guilty. Gina didn't respond. The life she had built, with all its careful architecture, had collapsed in a single moment. But she felt no urgency to rebuild it. Instead, she embraced the emptiness. There were brief moments of hesitation. A photo in her wallet. A scarf she had once shared with her sister. But she folded those feelings away like old letters, knowing she might read them again someday. But not now. For now she was no one. And for the first time, that felt like freedom. She took a train to a place she had never been. A coastal region up north where the ocean was colder, the streets quieter. She arrived without luggage, without contacts, without even a destination. She walked until her feet ached, then walked some more. Somewhere along the cliffs of Gangwon-do, where the wind smelled of salt and the sky stretched endlessly, she found a small motel and checked in under her new name. The room was plain, a bed, a lamp, a tiny desk by the window. She sat on the bed and listened to the silence. It did not scream. It did not accuse. It just was. And Gina, for once, let it be. The days melted into one another like wax in a forgotten candle. Gina no longer marked them with alarms, appointments, or expectations. Her new life in the obscure fishing village of Jumunjin existed outside time. She woke with the sun, ate, when she was hungry, and walked along the rocky coast until her legs ached. No one knew her name. No one asked where she came from. She was simply a woman renting a modest room above a closed tea house, paying in cash and keeping to herself. The silence was the loudest thing in her life now. She had deleted her social media on the first day and blocked every known number. Her bank cards were left behind, her apartment rent unpaid. She didn't check her email, she didn't tell her editor where she was going. Jin-ah had disappeared so cleanly, so efficiently, it was as if she had never existed. Except she had. And her absence was now its own kind of presence. In Seoul, Min Jun sat alone in their apartment, unable to comprehend how a person could vanish without a trace. He had assumed she would return, maybe after a few hours or days, but she didn't. Her phone went straight to voicemail. Her accounts were inaccessible. He found her clothes still hanging neatly in the closet, her toothbrush in its holder, her slippers by the bed. Silent accusations of abandonment. Of course, he didn't tell anyone the truth. How could he? Mi Kyung, however, was less restrained. Within a week, she began calling friends, colleagues, anyone who might know where Gina had gone. She told them her daughter was unstable, that she had fled in a fit of emotional distress. The story evolved quickly: a troubled marriage, a history of anxiety, perhaps even an affair. Anything that could make Mi Kyung seem like the concerned mother and Gina the unpredictable daughter. But the truth was harder to bury than Mi Kyung imagined. One of Gina's old colleagues, suspicious of the narrative, leaked the information to a journalist at a local paper. Rumors began to swirl. An anonymous source reported that Gina had been seen at a hotel in Gangwon-do under a different name. The hotel confirmed a cash transaction, but had no surveillance cameras. No one had spoken to her. No one had seen her leave. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed her whole. And the silence, her complete, unwavering silence, was louder than any accusation she could have made. Min Jun began unraveling in slow, visible ways. His lectures grew erratic, his sentences fragmented. He stopped shaving. At night, he scrolled through old photos of them, pausing at each smile, each moment where her hand rested lightly on his. He remembered their wedding night, her trembling fingers tightening around his in the darkness. He remembered her mother's speech that evening, so polished, so precise, praising the union as if it were a strategic alliance rather than a marriage. He remembered things differently now. Mi-kyung, for her part, maintained her composure in public, but the mask cracked behind closed doors. She kept sending messages to Jinna's old number, as if sheer persistence could penetrate the void. At one point, she left a voicemail crying, "Whatever I did, we can fix this. You're my daughter. I love you. Please come back." But love had never been what she offered, not truly. What she gave was control, wrapped in duty and expectation, and Jinna had finally broken free. Back in Jumunjin, Jinna spent her evenings sitting at the harbor, watching the boats drift back to shore. The sea reminded her of her father, an image hazy with age, a man she barely remembered, taken too soon by illness. He had been gentle, she was told, not like her mother, not like anyone else. Sometimes she wondered what he would have thought of the life she had built, the life she had just left behind. The locals began to notice her presence, but didn't question it. A few fishermen nodded politely when they passed. One woman offered her a bag of roasted chestnuts, which she accepted with a grateful bow. No one asked about her past. In Jumunjin, privacy was sacred, and silence was respected. One night, while sorting through the few things she had brought with her, she found an old photo of herself and Yunji, taken at a beach when they were children. They wore matching sun hats, their feet covered in sand. Jinna was holding her sister's hand tightly, smiling. Hyunji looked more carefree, already yearning for something beyond their mother's reach. Jinna hadn't spoken to her sister in years. Their last conversation had been brief, polite, empty. But she remembered how, as girls, they used to whisper to each other late at night, promising to escape one day. Yunji had kept that promise. Jinna hadn't. Until now. She didn't cry. There was a strange stillness in her emotions, as if the storm had passed but left behind a landscape so altered it was unrecognizable. She no longer felt sadness or even betrayal, just a kind of hollow clarity. She was not the woman she had pretended to be. She was not the daughter they had shaped her to become. And in her silence, she had found something dangerously close to truth. She walked down to the shore and stood barefoot at the edge of the tide. The cold water lapped against her ankles. Somewhere behind her, life continued. A baby crying, a man calling out about the catch of the day, the distant clink of dishes in a restaurant. But around her, inside her, there was only the rhythm of the sea. No phone calls, no explanations. No apologies, only silence. And for now that was enough. The air in Jumunjin carried a different kind of weight, brisk and damp, touched with salt. It didn't press down on Jinna as the air in Busan had. Instead, it moved around her gently, like the folds of a warm blanket. Each morning, the light filtered through the lace curtain of her rented room, dancing across the faded wooden floor in slow, swirling patterns. There was no alarm to wake her, no meetings to prepare for, no expectations to meet. She had disappeared into this coastal town as easily as fog dissolves into sea spray. Her days found their own rhythm. She took long walks before sunrise, watching the fishermen return with their nets heavy and dripping. At a small market by the docks, she bought vegetables, rice, and sometimes dried squid. She learned to cook simple dishes again, quietly, precisely, as if each meal were a ritual for reclaiming control. No one asked her name, no one probed. In a town where everyone had their own reasons for silence, hers was neither unusual nor unwelcome. One grey afternoon, as a light drizzle misted the harbor, Jinna stood watching a fisherman guide his boat toward the shore. He moved with the practiced ease of someone who had done the same work for decades, his arms steady, his posture relaxed, but alert. A young girl stood by the dock waiting for him, her raincoat too big for her tiny frame, her boots covered in mud. The man was Han Newell. He was in his mid-40s, broad-shouldered, with salt and pepper hair and skin leathered by sun and wind. When he reached the dock, he smiled down at the girl and handed her a small fish, which she cradled like a treasure. Jinnah watched the exchange from a distance, unmoving. The next day she saw them again, this time at the same market where she bought her groceries. The girl was tugging at his sleeve, pointing at a bundle of sweet potatoes. Hanyul noticed, Jinnah watching, and nodded politely. She returned the gesture, her eyes dropping immediately. She wasn't ready for conversations. Not yet, but the town had a way of pulling people together. A few days later she heard a knock on her door. It was the landlady, a stout woman named Sunja, who ran the tea house downstairs but hadn't opened it since her husband died. "You're good with books, right?" she asked. "Hanul's daughter is struggling in school. He asked if someone could help her with reading." "I said I'd ask you." Jinnah hesitated. The urge to remain invisible was still strong, but something in the landlady's tone left no room for refusal. That evening she followed Sunja to Hanul's modest home near the southern edge of the village. The girl's name was Suwa. She was 7 years old, shy but curious. She didn't speak much at first, only peeking at Jinnah with wide eyes from behind her father's leg. Hanul introduced himself softly, offering tea in mismatched cups. His home was neat but simple, photos of his late wife on the wall, children's, drawings taped near the fridge, the scent of salt and herbs in the air. Jinnah sat at the low table with Suwa, reviewing her textbooks. The girl struggled with spacing between characters, skipping over difficult words. Jinnah corrected her gently, without pressure. She remembered what it felt like to be afraid of getting things wrong. Her voice stayed low, encouraging. Suwa began to smile. Over the following weeks these visits became routine. Twice a week Jinnah helped Suwa with reading and writing. Sometimes Hanul would cook dinner afterward, simple meals of grilled fish and rice. They didn't ask each other questions. They spoke only when necessary, yet something warm and cautious began to bloom between them, like a plant stretching toward light through cracks in concrete. Jinnah learned that Hanul had lost his wife 3 years earlier to cancer. He had left the city behind to raise Suwa near the sea where he had grown up. "She needed peace," he said one evening, as they sat watching the horizon blur into dusk. "And maybe, so did I." He didn't ask about her past. He seemed to know instinctively that some silences should be honored, but in his quiet presence, Jinnah found a rare comfort. There were no expectations, no demands, no masks. For the first time in years she laughed, not a performative smile, not a polite chuckle, a real laugh, sudden and unguarded, when Suwa tried to read aloud with exaggerated drama and ended up falling off her cushion. The child's giggle echoed through the room, and Jinnah joined her without thinking. Later that night, walking back to her rented room, Jinnah realized something unsettling. The peace she had found here wasn't false. It wasn't distraction. It was genuine. But it wasn't a life. Not yet. It was a pause. A beautiful, aching pause in a symphony she had once played by heart. She stood by the sea, the waves crashing against the rocks below. She could see her breath in the cold night air. And she knew this calm couldn't last forever. It wasn't meant to. She was healing, yes. But healing wasn't the same as living, and the world she had escaped from still waited on the other side of silence. Still, for now, she allowed herself this refuge. This soft season of recovery. No mirrors, no judgments. Just a girl who once vanished, learning to be seen again. The coastal winds of Jumunjin were shifting, no longer carrying the same stillness that had once soothed Jinnah's chest. With each passing day, the sense of peace she had nurtured began to tremble under the weight of a new realization. The world she had left behind was not remaining quiet. Her disappearance, once empowering, was beginning to feel like silence imposed rather than chosen. News filtered into the village slowly. It began with a conversation overheard at the market. An older man reading a crumpled newspaper aloud mentioned the name Min Jun. Jinnah had stiffened where she stood, her hands frozen over a basket of scallions. Later that week, Sunja brought up that the professor from Seoul had been seen on a talk show discussing education reform. No mention of his missing wife. She didn't react outwardly, but something inside her curdled. That night, alone in her small room, she turned on the old radio tucked behind a stack of unused plates. Tuning through static, she caught a local news brief. Min-jun and Mi-kyung, well-known figures in Busan's academic and civic circles, hosted a panel on family values and public responsibility. Family values. The phrase struck her like a blade sharpened with hypocrisy. She began to gather fragments, small, quiet pieces of information that spoke volumes. A photo on a gossip blog showing Min-jun and Mi-kyung at a museum fundraiser, dressed in coordinated colors, smiling as if nothing had ever been broken. A local article quoting Mi-kyung praising the strength of family in overcoming loss and confusion. But no statement about Jinnah, no plea for her return, no acknowledgement of what they had done. Worse still, a rumor had taken root. Jinnah had simply left. Coldly, irrationally, without reason. Some even whispered that she had abandoned her husband and mother due to personal instability. She had become a cautionary tale, a footnote in her own story. She waited for a letter, a message, a single word of regret. But it never came. The silence, once her sanctuary, now roared with betrayal. That winter the sea turned violent. The waves crashed harder against the shore, and the air carried a chill that no coat could completely dispel. Jinnah stopped visiting the harbor. She began waking in the middle of the night, heart pounding, lungs tight, as if drowning in memories she could no longer suppress. She returned one day from the market to find Ha-neul waiting on the steps of her building. His usual calm was shadowed by concern. "Sunja told me what she heard," he said softly. "I thought you might want someone to sit with." She said nothing, only unlocked the door and let him follow. Inside, they sat across from each other at the small table, a pot of barley tea between them, steam curling in the silence. She finally spoke, her voice low and even. "They're together now, my mother and my husband." Ha-neul didn't blink. He nodded slowly, as if he had known without being told. "They act like I never existed," she continued. "Like I was the mistake that embarrassed them both." "You're not," he said simply. "But they think I am." She let out a bitter laugh. "And the worst part? I waited. I waited for them to say something. Anything. Even a lie dressed up as an apology would have meant they felt guilt. But no, they pretend I vanished because I was fragile, not because they broke me." Ha-neul didn't interrupt. He understood that some things needed space more than comfort. Jinnah stood and walked to the window, looking out at the blurred lights of the village below. "I came here to disappear, but I didn't disappear, I was erased." That night, after Ha-neul left, she began writing again. Not translations, not fiction, just words, pages of them. She wrote about the weight of pretending, the loneliness of being loved only on condition of obedience. She wrote about the betrayal, the humiliation, the silence that followed. Her hand ached, but she kept going. The words poured out like blood from an old wound. She didn't write for revenge. She wrote to name things. What had happened, what had been taken, what had been denied. And somewhere in those pages, she found something stronger than grief, anger. Not wild or chaotic, but focused, pure. For so long she had tried to be good, good daughter, good wife, good woman. But all that goodness had given her was abandonment and revisionist history. Now for the first time, she let herself feel something else. Not sorrow, not fear, rage. It wasn't the kind that burned everything down. It was the kind that clarified. She stopped avoiding mirrors. She began walking with her head higher. At night, she returned to the sea and watched the waves without flinching. She even taught Sua how to write her name in cursive, the child's laughter ringing like a bell against the darkening sky. The apology never came. But that no longer mattered, because Jinnah had finally stopped waiting, and in that refusal she found power. The 32nd birthday of Jinnah began like a whisper, silent, cold, and without witness. The sky above Jumunjin was an overcast canvas, smudged with shades of grey and white that blurred the horizon into the sea. No voices sang her name. No hands reached across a breakfast table to pass her a gift wrapped in pastel colors. There was no aroma of seaweed soup boiling on the stove, no mother humming out of tune, no husband pretending to have remembered. There was only silence. She awoke late that morning, her limbs slow to obey, and stayed beneath the thick quilt long after the room had grown bright with winter light. The warmth around her was shallow, only enough to delay the cold, not defeat it. Birthdays, once a painful stage upon which she performed the illusion of happiness, no longer carried anticipation or dread, only distance. She hadn't celebrated in years, not sincerely. The last time someone had looked her in the eyes on her birthday and asked, "What do you want?" had been when she was still a teenager, and even then the question had come from Yunji. She finally rose and moved to the window. From her second-floor room she could see the village stretching quietly toward the coast, the houses huddled like secrets. The tide was high, restless, licking at the rocks with soft rage. Children in padded jackets ran between the piers, laughing about something she could not hear. Life, it seemed, continued without her. She made tea slowly, deliberately, boiled the water, measured the leaves, let them steep. She sipped without hunger. The steam warmed her lips, but not her chest. Everything tasted like waiting. That was when she noticed it. An envelope slipped under the door. It was cream-colored, faintly creased and sealed with no markings. She picked it up with cautious fingers. The handwriting on the front was rushed, the ink slightly smudged from moisture. But it was unmistakable. Yunji. Her breath hitched. She hadn't seen her sister in years, hadn't heard from her since before she vanished. They had grown apart long before the disappearance, their bond frayed by geography and the emotional erosion of a shared upbringing. Still, Jinna's fingers trembled as she tore the envelope open. The letter inside was written by hand, slightly uneven, like someone writing under a deadline or a storm. "Annie, I don't know if this will reach you. Maybe you'll tear it up without reading. Maybe you're long gone. But I couldn't let today pass in silence. I remember your birthdays more than I remember my own. You always acted like it was nothing, but I knew you waited for someone to say something real. So here it is. Happy birthday. There's something you should know. Tonight in Busan, there's a party. A gathering, a celebration of family unity, they're calling it. Minjun and Mikyung planned it together. A perfectly curated event. A few speeches, some wine, all very respectable. They're not mentioning you, not by name, but they are saying you left, that you were overwhelmed, that you walked away, from everything without reason. They're rewriting you, Annie. I kept quiet for too long. I told myself it wasn't my battle, that you had made your choice. But now I see the lie for what it is, and I'm sorry for not standing by you, for not asking sooner, for letting them turn you into a ghost. If you ever decide to come back, I'll be waiting. Love. Yunji. Jinna read the letter 3 times, the first time as a sister, the second time as a stranger, the third time as someone trying to measure the shape of her own rage. When she finished, she folded it carefully and pressed it to her chest. There were no tears, only a tightening sensation at the base of her throat, like a scream unvoiced for years, finally finding form. She walked outside into the biting air, the wind curling strands of hair around her face. The streets were quiet, save for the occasional honk of a truck turning the bend near the dock. She walked until her legs found the rhythm again, her thoughts circling the same point. They were telling people she had broken, that she had left because she couldn't handle life. But she hadn't broken. She had been broken. She sat on a bench overlooking the sea, the letter still in her coat pocket. The ocean stretched outward, unforgiving and endless. She imagined the room where the party would take place. Glass walls, curated flower arrangements, the soft clink of champagne. Floats. Mikyung in her signature pastels, smiling with precision. Minjun beside her, hands folded neatly, nodding like he believed every word that left her lips. The story they told had no villain, only a disappearance. A void, filled with comfortable assumptions. But Jinna was not a void. She was flesh, memory, fire. She stood and walked back to her room. There she changed slowly, brushed her hair until it gleamed, selected a coat she hadn't worn since the day she vanished. In the mirror, she saw a woman no longer running, no longer silent, not the obedient daughter, not the perfect wife. She wasn't returning to reclaim her place in their world. She was returning to expose it. The train from Jumonjin to Seoul moved steadily through the landscape, carving its path between frozen fields and mountains, still holding on to remnants of snow. Jinna sat by the window, unmoving, her gaze fixed on the blur of countryside, though she didn't truly see any of it. She had packed lightly, a single suitcase, a coat folded neatly over her lap, and the letter from Unji tucked inside her wallet. It wasn't nostalgia that brought her back. It wasn't even closure. It was something far more deliberate. She arrived in Seoul just before dusk. The city lights blinked like artificial stars, and everything pulsed with motion and urgency. She stepped out into the winter air, which felt different from the quiet cold of Jumonjin, sharper, more metallic. The crowds moved around her, but no one saw her. Not yet. She didn't go home. Instead, she went straight to her old publisher's office. The building looked the same, tall, sleek, and trying too hard to look timeless. She entered without hesitation, the receptionist glancing up only briefly before doing a double-take. "Miss Seo?" she asked, half-standing. Jinna smiled, but it wasn't the soft, apologetic smile she used to wear. "I have a proposal." A few phone calls later, she was seated in the office of Editor Park, the man who had first taken a chance on her when she was a fresh-faced translator, obsessed with French literature. He looked older now, thinner, but his eyes still scanned people with the precision of someone used to reading between lines. "Jinna," he said, sitting back, "you disappeared." "I know," she replied. He didn't ask why. Perhaps he knew better. Perhaps he simply didn't care. Business was business, after all. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. Inside were pages, printed, not digital, bound together with a single metal clip. She handed it over. "It's fiction," she said calmly, "but every word is true." He raised an eyebrow, flipping through the first few pages. His expression changed gradually, from polite interest to quiet tension. "This is a story about a daughter, a mother, a marriage, all the things that look beautiful on the outside." He set the pages down. "You're naming names." "No," she said, "I don't have to. The city will recognize them anyway." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded once. "We'll discuss terms tomorrow, but this is going to stir things up." "That's the idea." That evening, she rented a small apartment in the same neighborhood where it had all begun. Not the old apartment, she had no interest in reclaiming that space, but a new place with an angled view of the skyline and a quiet hallway. The furniture was minimal, but she didn't need much. She was not here to rebuild a past. She was here to bear witness. The next day, she began observing. She took walks around the blocks where her former life had unfolded. She watched from a distance as Minjun left the university in the late afternoon, his coat buttoned, his gait slower than she remembered. She noted the way he looked over his shoulder as he entered cafes, as if expecting someone to follow. She watched Mi-kyung leave the community center, dressed in a camel-colored coat, her hair in a perfect twist. People greeted her warmly. She smiled back as if nothing in her life had ever broken. Jinna didn't approach them. She just watched, quiet, constant, unyielding. Days later, excerpts from her manuscript began circulating online, leaked by someone at the publisher, perhaps, intentionally. The story of a woman raised under the weight of perfection, of a marriage that crumbled under deception, of a mother who confused control with love. It all surfaced like a ghost that refused to stay buried. Though the characters had different names, different settings, the tone was unmistakable. Those who knew her, colleagues, neighbors, even old university friends, read between the lines with uncomfortable ease. And the city began to murmur. Mi-kyung heard the whispers first. At a luncheon, someone asked if she had read the new story being passed around. At a parent meeting, an old acquaintance paused too long before asking, "Is everything all right? With your family?" Minjun was slower to react. At first, he assumed it was coincidence. Then, when a student left a copy of the excerpt on his desk with a post-it note that read, "Fiction," he understood. Jinna had returned. Not with lawyers, not with threats, with words. She went back to the publisher to finalize the deal. The book would be released in the spring under a pseudonym. But the marketing strategy was clear. The story was a reflection of contemporary families, societal expectations, and the quiet devastation behind perfect facades. No one said her name, but they didn't need to. One afternoon, while leaving the building, she passed a mirror in the elevator. She looked at her reflection and paused. She looked different, not just older, not just thinner. She looked alive in a way she never had before. This woman was no longer seeking approval. She was becoming truth. The winter in Seoul grew harsher as the days shortened, but the cold wasn't enough to quiet the whispers. By the time the first official announcement of Jinna's new book appeared on the website of her former publisher, the city was already humming with speculation. The title, Beneath the Quiet Roof, was neutral, almost gentle. But the synopsis revealed deeper undercurrents. A fictional tale about loyalty, betrayal, and the invisible chains between mothers and daughters. Within hours of the previews, release blogs and discussion forums lit up with theories. Who was the author hiding behind the pseudonym? Was it a social critique, a memoir in disguise, or a veiled attack against someone prominent? It didn't take long for people to guess. Though Jinna's name never appeared, her style was unmistakable to those who had followed her translation work. Colleagues, former classmates, and even distant acquaintances connected the dots. And once connected, the implications became impossible to ignore. In the novel, a young woman named Ji-won is raised by a mother who controls her with a smile and a hand on her shoulder, the grip always too tight. She marries a man who seems perfect, calm, academic, attentive, until the facade breaks and the two people she trusted most become one in her absence. Ji-won disappears, not with fanfare, but with silence. And when she returns, it is not to reclaim her place, it is to remove the mask from theirs. The story didn't accuse directly. But the details, the descriptions of Busan, the rhythms of academic life, the characterization of a mother with civil service prestige, were far too specific to be dismissed as fiction. News outlets picked up the story slowly, cautiously. An article on a mid-sized cultural site posed the question, fiction or confession? Another suggested it was a brave narrative challenging Korea's rigid family ideals. A few conservative voices pushed back, calling the book sensationalist, attention-seeking. But the majority were drawn in by the possibility that something real, something long hidden, had surfaced through art. Mi Kyung was the first to respond, not publicly, but within her private circles. She dismissed the book as immature rebellion in a message to a friend, claiming it was beneath acknowledgement. But the shift in her posture was unmistakable. At meetings, she spoke more cautiously. Her once constant smile became brittle. People she'd once charmed now eyed her with quiet uncertainty. Min Jun, on the other hand, tried to dismiss it altogether. At the university, he laughed off questions from younger professors. A work of fiction, he said, adjusting his glasses, clearly a dramatic one. But he checked online forums late at night, searching for posts that might expose him, his inbox filled with cryptic messages. You always said, truth was subjective, Professor. Still feel that way. Jinna watched it all unfold from a distance. She didn't give interviews. She didn't release statements. Her publisher managed the media storm with calculated detachment, feeding just enough intrigue to keep the public engaged, but never confirming her identity. The manuscript had already gone to print, and with every comment, every new article, every message posted beneath the preview online, Jinna felt her silence gaining mass. She walked through the city unnoticed, headphones in her ears, but no music playing. She stood outside the university gates one morning, watching students shuffle past, heavy with winter coats and final exam stress. She saw Min Jun exit the main building, his shoulders tense. He stopped at a food stall and ordered tea, glancing around as if expecting someone. Jinna didn't move. She didn't want confrontation. That time would come, perhaps. But for now, she wanted him to feel what she had felt, watched, uncertain, exposed. One evening she met Yoonji in a small cafe in Itaewon, tucked behind a flower shop. It was the first time they'd seen each other in over 4 years. Yoonji looked older, more grounded, her once sharp voice now softened by regret. "I read it," she said as she stirred her coffee. "I knew it was you by the 2nd chapter. I didn't write it for them," Jinna said. "I know, but they'll hear it anyway." They talked for hours, not just about the book, but about childhood, about their mother's quiet discipline, about how they had both learned to perform roles they never chose. Yoonji apologized again, more fully this time, not as a sister seeking forgiveness, but as a woman who finally saw the pattern they had both endured. "I didn't defend you," she said, "and I should have." "You weren't supposed to," Jinna replied. "She raised us to protect her, not each other." Yoonji reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "That ends now." In the days that followed, as more copies of the book reached advance reviewers and literary critics, the tension escalated. A prominent columnist wrote a piece titled "When Fiction is Too Familiar," noting the uncanny similarities between Mi-kyung and the mother in the novel. Social media exploded with threads dissecting passages line by line, drawing comparisons, sharing personal stories that echoed the novel's themes. People began to see not just Gina's pain but their own. The truth wasn't just leaking, it was flooding. The flood of attention surrounding the book did not subside. It spread, first among readers, then among academics, and finally among people who had never before questioned the stories they had been told about their own families. The city, and parts beyond, were now full of conversations sparked by a single text that dared to unravel the myth of filial duty, of marriage as sanctuary, of silence as virtue. For Jinna, the noise outside contrasted with a deeper, quieter storm within. Her days were spent alone in the apartment she now called her own, not out of fear, but by choice. It was a space where she could write freely, think freely, and, more importantly, remember. Because remembering, she now understood, was not just a backward glance, it was an act of survival. One afternoon, while sorting through the final revisions of a second manuscript, this time essays sharper and even more revealing, her doorbell rang. She opened it cautiously, half expecting a reporter. Instead, she found Yoonji holding a plastic bag filled with old photo albums and a faded shoebox. "Do you remember these?" her sister asked, stepping inside. Jinna nodded. The box had been kept on the highest shelf of their mother's old hallway closet. Mi-kyung had once forbidden them to touch it, claiming it contained adult papers. They had both believed it for years. They spread everything out on the floor. Inside were old school reports, faded letters from relatives, and a few notebooks filled with Mi-kyung's neat handwriting. There were also small strange things, clippings of local newspaper announcements, birthday cards addressed not to Jinna or Yoonji, but to a name neither of them recognized, a name crossed out in black ink. It took time and care to piece it all together. One notebook in particular held their attention. It was a kind of log, an account of behavioral notes, decisions, and observations about both daughters. Written in the third person, as if Mi-kyung were documenting not children but case studies. Jinna responded poorly to correction today, must limit reading time to increase discipline. Yoonji continues to reject scheduled activities, remove privileges. Jinna shows potential in literature, encourage only controlled exposure. The tone was clinical, detached, almost chilling, as if love had been replaced with performance metrics, as if their mother had raised them not as people, but as projects. "This explains so much," Yoonji said, flipping through the pages. "I always thought it was just me, that I was the disappointment and you were the favorite." "I was never the favorite," Jinna murmured. "I was just more useful." The weight of those words settled between them like dust on the photos. They looked through the albums together, frame by frame, smiles forced, hands placed just so, events recorded more for appearances than for memory. But beneath each image was another truth, faint glimpses of resistance, a flicker in the eye, a hand held too tightly, a space deliberately kept between siblings. They uncovered a diary that had belonged to their late grandmother. It was Mi-kyung's mother, a quiet, woman who had passed when Jinna was in middle school. The entries were brief, but revealing. Mi-kyung never lets the girls speak freely. She controls even their games. I tried to talk to her today about Yoonji's drawings. She told me I was old-fashioned and naive. Jinna looks so tired lately. I worry she's forgetting how to be a child. Jinna traced the lines with her fingers, as if the words could anchor her to a past that had always been distorted. For so long she had believed the fracture began with the betrayal, Minjun Mi-kyung that quiet afternoon behind a half-open door. But now she saw it more clearly. The betrayal had not started in adulthood. It had begun in childhood, in every silenced opinion, in every compliment disguised as control, in every time she had been told that her feelings were not appropriate, not productive, not acceptable. That night, she and Yoonji stayed up late in the apartment, drinking tea and speaking without filters. They talked about the dreams they had, discarded, the moments when they had turned on each other because it was safer than turning on their mother. They talked about the men who mirrored Mi-kyung in quieter ways, cold, ambitious, hungry for admiration, but terrified of intimacy. And they made a decision. They would publish the notebooks, not publicly, not in the press, but as an appendix to Jinna's upcoming collection of essays, which the publisher had already accepted with caution. The entries would be anonymized, presented as psychological case notes from an unnamed household, but those who had read beneath the quiet roof would understand. They would read between the lines. The idea was not to shame Mi-kyung. It was to liberate those who had lived under similar roofs. Jinna wrote the introduction herself. This is not revenge. This is documentation. For every daughter who grew up trying to earn love that was already supposed to be hers. For every child who mistook obedience for safety. For every woman who disappeared to survive and returned to speak. The past was no longer a weight to carry alone. It was now a map, one that led others through the same terrain she had once wandered blind. The auditorium was pristine, its polished floors gleaming beneath the soft overhead lighting. Rows of white chairs had been arranged in orderly lines, facing a modest stage adorned with flowers in pastel hues. A banner stretched across the top, Community and Renewal, a family initiative. At the center of the arrangement stood Mi-kyung and Minjun, poised and polished, exactly as they had rehearsed. It was a public event, sponsored by a cultural foundation, the kind that subtly boosts reputations while appearing altruistic. Mi-kyung had orchestrated the entire thing, framing it as a joint project between former public servants and educators to promote social well-being. Minjun was the academic face, she the maternal anchor. It was meant to reframe the narrative one final time. They had heard the murmurs about the novel, about the essay collection, about the unnamed fiction that too closely resembled truth. But they believed appearances could still save them. They believed wrong. Jinna arrived 10 minutes before the event began. She wore a dark green coat, tailored and simple, and kept her hair down around her face. She sat in the third row, center, aisle without hiding. She didn't flinch when her mother stepped onto the stage. She didn't look away when Minjun adjusted the microphone and began his opening remarks. The audience consisted of civic leaders, professors, neighbors, journalists, and a handful of curious onlookers drawn by the book's growing controversy. Many of them recognized Jinna as she sat unmoving, her eyes fixed forward. She saw the ripple in their expressions, a quick flicker of awareness, followed by uncertainty. No one approached her, but no one ignored her either. Mi-kyung took the podium with the ease of a practiced speaker. Today, she began, we gather to affirm the values that hold our communities together: respect, duty, and healing. Jinna's fingers tightened around the notebook. In her lap. The family is the first school, Mi-kyung continued. It is where we learn to forgive, to listen, and to rebuild. Jinna stood up. The sound of her chair sliding back echoed across the hall like a sharp breath. Heads turned. Some gasped. Mi-kyung froze. Jinna walked down the narrow aisle, not hurriedly, not dramatically, just deliberately. She climbed the steps to the stage and stopped at the edge of the podium. Minjun stepped back instinctively, as if the nearness of her presence unbalanced him. "May I?" Jinna asked, her voice carrying. Clear and low. Mi-kyung hesitated. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. A moderator moved forward, unsure whether to intervene, but the audience was already leaning in, transfixed. Jinnah took the microphone. "I want to talk about silence," she began, "and about the cost of appearing whole." No one interrupted her. "We live in a culture where appearances matter more than honesty, where obedience is rewarded and questioning is seen as rebellion. I was raised in such a home that smiled in public and corrected in private, a home where I learned to smile too, even when everything inside me was cracking." There was no anger in her voice, no theatrics, only clarity. "I was taught that my worth came from perfection, that love was something to be earned, and that mistakes, especially emotional ones, meant failure. I carried that teaching into my marriage, into my career, into every quiet room I ever sat in, waiting to be good enough." Someone in the back of the room was crying, softly. "I disappeared once, not because I was unstable, but because I was exhausted. Because the people who should have protected me used my silence to protect themselves." She glanced briefly at Minjun, then Mi-kyung. "But silence isn't the absence of pain. It's the camouflage of it. And today I choose to be visible." A long pause settled over the room. Jinnah looked out at the audience, scanning each face. "I won't name names. I don't need to. Those who know will recognize themselves. Those who don't may see someone they've hurt without realizing it." She stepped back from the microphone. Mi-kyung moved as if to speak, but the silence that followed was absolute. Her hands trembled slightly at her sides, and for the first time the mask of control slipped. Her carefully constructed smile flickered. The room watched her, some with curiosity, others with pity, and many with judgment sharpened by recognition. Minjun didn't speak. His shoulders sagged slightly. He looked down at his shoes, no longer able to meet her eyes. Jinnah turned and descended the stage without ceremony. She didn't wait for applause. There was none, only stillness, and in that stillness, an understanding more powerful than ovation. Outside, the air was crisp. She inhaled deeply and walked. Without haste, her boots clicking softly on the pavement. Behind her, the event continued in disarray. Guests unsure whether to stay, organizers scrambling to recover the agenda. But none of it mattered. She had said what needed to be said, in public, in daylight, and there was no taking it back. The echo of Jinnah's speech did not fade with the closing of the auditorium doors. It traveled through hallways, over cell phone recordings, and into the ears of those who had once stayed silent. By nightfall, a video clip had surfaced online, blurry, distant, but unmistakably real. The quiet intensity of her words, the unwavering steadiness in her posture, and the shocked stillness of her mother and ex-husband behind her. It spread, fast, not like a scandal, like a reckoning. The public didn't ask whether the story was true. They asked why it had taken so long to be said. By morning, major online news outlets picked up the footage. "Unidentified woman interrupts civic event with powerful speech on emotional abuse" became a headline. But within hours, her identity was confirmed. Photos from past lectures and book launches resurfaced, piecing together the story. Jinnah Seo, the translator-turned-author who vanished. No longer a footnote, now a voice. Mi-kyung did not make a statement that day, neither did Minjun. They retreated behind doors, hoping the noise would pass, but this time the silence betrayed them. And then something truly unexpected happened. 3 days after the event, a handwritten letter arrived at Jinnah's apartment. No return address, but the handwriting was unmistakably his. Minjun. She waited a full day before opening it. "Jinnah, I don't know if you'll read this. You have no reason to trust me. I could say I'm sorry, and I am. I could say I was weak, and I was. But I doubt either of those things matter anymore. I didn't write to explain what happened. I don't deserve that chance. I wrote because, for the first time, I watched you speak freely, and I realized I had never seen you before. Not truly. I saw what I was told to see, a wife, a partner, a balance to my world, but not a person. Your mother is... She's powerful in ways I didn't understand until too late. She made me believe I was rescuing you when, in truth, I was helping her cage you. I let her rewrite the narrative because it was easier than confronting my guilt. I let her take center stage because that's what she demanded. I knew what I had done, and I chose the path that required the least courage. I'm stepping away from her, from the lies, from the version of myself I protected by letting you disappear. You were right to leave. I only wish I had the strength to say this sooner. I will not contact you again unless invited. But I will. And not deny your story. For whatever it's worth now I see you. Minjun. She reread the letter in full silence, not with tears, not with anger. With a curious stillness, it was not redemption, it was not reconciliation, but it was acknowledgement. That mattered. More striking was what came next. Mi Kyung, in contrast, chose war. She filed a formal lawsuit for defamation. The papers arrived, with her name in full at the top, citing damages to her reputation, social standing, and emotional well-being. The claim was careful, constructed by lawyers who specialized in image defense. They argued that while the novel and the essays did not name her directly, the public nature of the revelations had clearly targeted her, causing irreversible harm. It was not unexpected. Jinnah had known, from the moment she stood on that stage, that her mother would never accept exposure without retaliation. But what surprised everyone else was the reaction the lawsuit triggered. Support poured in. Readers, activists, former students, women and men who had been raised under the weight of parental control, who had been told to smile and stay silent. Social media turned the lawsuit into a movement. Hashtags formed. Articles were written defending Jinnah's right to narrate her own experience. A petition against the misuse of defamation laws to silence emotional abuse survivors gained traction. What had begun as a literary conversation became a cultural shift. People started telling their own stories. A young lawyer offered to defend Jinnah pro bono. She declined at first, but when the pressure increased, she accepted. Not because she feared losing, but because it was no longer about just her. Her case had become emblematic. Yoonji appeared at her side more frequently, in interviews, in private gatherings, even at literary panels discussing the ethics of autobiographical fiction. She spoke gently but firmly about what they had endured. She talked about love withheld and guilt planted like seeds. She did not spare her mother, but neither did she dehumanize her. Mi Kyung shaped us with tools of control, she said during one live broadcast. But we survived her without becoming her. That, I think, is the point. Meanwhile, Jinnah returned to Jumunjin for a few days, needing the sea again. She brought with her a small box. Inside, copies of both books, a handwritten note, and a seashell Suah had once given her. She visited Hanul and his daughter, standing at the gate like someone arriving home after a long journey. Suah ran to her first, arms wide. Jinnah knelt and opened the box. "I brought you a story," she said. Hanul watched from the doorway, his face unchanged, but his eyes full of the weight he'd carried in her absence. He said nothing, only stepped aside to let her in. That night, for the first time in months, she slept without waking in the middle of the night. The war had begun, but Jinnah was no longer a woman who trembled before conflict. She was a woman whose truth had been seen and could not be unseen. The courtroom was not grand. It was sterile and impersonal, off-white walls, wooden benches, too polished to feel human, and a scent of paper and floor polish that reminded Jinnah of her school days. Yet despite its austerity, the room held a tension thick enough to press against her spine. Mi Kyung sat on the opposite side, poised in a grey suit, with an expression that betrayed neither fury nor shame. Her posture was immaculate, her face unreadable. She didn't look at Jinnah once, not when the lawyers entered, not when the judge asked them to rise, not even when the opening statements began. The case had not yet gone to trial, but preliminary hearings had already drawn attention. Journalists lined the hallway, and even a national news channel had sent a quiet observer. People wanted to see what would happen when a mother sued her daughter for the truth she dared to speak. Jinnah listened as her lawyer explained the argument, that a personal experience, expressed through fiction and essays, was not defamatory if it didn't falsely accuse or fabricate. That emotional abuse, often invisible, had a right to be named. That survivors had the right to tell their stories, even when those stories made others uncomfortable. Mi Kyung's attorney countered with a clinical tone. The harm to reputation, the implications, the intentional vagueness of names and places, clearly designed to point fingers without accountability. It wasn't just a legal debate, it was a philosophical one. Who owns a story? And when pain has no proof but memory, how do you weigh its cost? Outside the courtroom, the public had already decided. Sales of Jinna's books doubled in less than a month. University panels invited her to speak on ethics and authorship. Bookstores created sections titled Healing Through Truth, where her title sat beside memoirs, novels, and essays written by others who had stepped forward. Her story opened a floodgate, not just of trauma, but of agency. But with recognition came exhaustion. Some days, Jinnah woke with a heaviness that felt like wearing wet fabric. The burden of representation, of being seen not just as herself, but as a symbol, was immense. She met readers who thanked her through tears, strangers who sent her letters recounting their own mothers, their own silences. She read every word. She responded when she could, but it cost her. She continued to write, but her tone shifted. Less fury, more reflection. She focused on the shape of recovery, not linear, not triumphant, but textured. Some essays spoke of mornings when she couldn't move. Others chronicled brief joys, a meal shared in silence, a child's drawing, the softness of solitude reclaimed. And then there were the nights when the truth weighed most. One of those nights brought her back to Hanul's home. He had invited her and Yunji for dinner, a quiet gathering with Suah bouncing between rooms, proudly showing off her schoolwork. The table was modest, grilled mackerel, rice, soup, but the warmth filled every corner of the small kitchen. After dinner, while Suah drew by the heater, Hanul handed Jinnah a wooden box. "I made this for you," he said simply. Inside was a handcrafted pen and a small journal bound in blue linen. She ran her fingers over it, tracing the grain. "Of the wood. It's beautiful. It's yours. For the words that come after the fire." She opened the journal that night in her apartment and began writing, not to defend herself, not to convince anyone of her story, but to name what the truth had done. It had cost her relationships, certainty, sleep. It had exposed her to scrutiny, turned her into a subject of analysis and debate, but it had also given her something she had never truly possessed: voice, not borrowed, not assigned, owned. The defamation case lingered, unresolved. The court delayed judgment, pending further review. But regardless of outcome, Jinnah knew that something irreversible had already happened. Her mother's image could not be salvaged by legal paperwork. Minjun's apology, quiet as it was, had already begun reshaping how his colleagues saw him. And Jinnah, she had moved beyond their shadows. She had become the story they tried to erase. As spring approached, she returned once more to Jumunjin, not to disappear this time, but to give something back. She brought books for the local school, helped repaint the reading room with volunteers. She taught Suah how to craft her own stories, how to listen for the voice inside that no one else could write for her. When she walked by the harbor, fishermen greeted her not as a mystery but as part of the rhythm of the place. One morning, she stood on the rocky cliff she had visited during her first days of exile. The sea stretched out before her, unchanged and immense. She let the wind press against her body, her coat billowing like a flag. The truth had been heavy, but she had carried it, and it had carried her back to herself. The streets of Busan stirred gently in the pre-dawn hush. A pale blue light hovered over the rooftops, brushing the buildings in the early softness of a new day. Jinnah walked alone through those familiar streets, now stripped of the meanings they once held. She wasn't in disguise. She wasn't hiding. She was simply present, steps measured, gaze forward, breath steady against the salty breeze. She passed the bench where she once waited for Minjun on their first anniversary, the cafe where Mi Kyung had taken her for tea after berating her at a family dinner, the library where she had spent entire afternoons translating texts, believing that precision and beauty in language could somehow shield her from the mess of real life. Now all of it was quiet. There had been no ruling yet in the lawsuit, but she no longer needed the outcome to validate her. Public sentiment had already turned. The courtroom had become a stage for Mi Kyung's unraveling, not because Jinnah had destroyed her, but because the woman who had built her life on control had been finally asked to account for it in full daylight. Min Jun had left the city weeks ago. He took a position at a smaller university near Jeonju. He didn't reach out again, and Jinnah didn't expect him to. She didn't want closure in the form of confessions or shared grief. Some endings were meant to remain silent. Mi Kyung, on the other hand, persisted. Her public appearances had dwindled, but she clung to her narrative in private. Letters to former colleagues, conversations carefully constructed. Yet even among her loyalists, something had shifted. A doubt, a pause, a re-examination. The voice of Jinnah had not just pierced her silence, it had made others listen to their own. As for Jinnah, she was no longer the woman who once rehearsed politeness before each encounter. She no longer flinched when asked about family. She no longer filtered her speech to avoid discomfort. She had become unapologetically whole. That morning, she walked to the cliffs above Haeundae, where the sea stretched endlessly in every direction. The horizon was brushed with gold now, the sun rising slowly, carefully, as if honoring the weight of the moment. She stood still, the wind lifting strands of her hair, her coat rustling softly at her ankles. There was no audience, no cameras, no one waiting to record her next move. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply. She didn't think of vengeance or victory. She thought of all the versions of herself that had been left behind. The child who tried to win love by being perfect. The teenager who swallowed her voice to avoid her mother's glare. The wife who apologized without knowing why. The woman who disappeared because speaking had once seemed impossible. They were still part of her, but they no longer defined her. The silence that had once bound her now stood behind her, like a wall she had torn down stone by stone. Not with screaming, not with spectacle, with presence, with endurance, with truth. A bird flew low across the edge of the cliff, slicing the wind with ease. Jinnah opened her eyes. Behind her, the city was waking. She turned and began to walk down the path, each step slow but sure. The world ahead wasn't promising redemption or ease, but it was hers. She would continue to write, to speak, to listen. She would return to Jumunjin often, maybe make a home there one day, but for now she chose movement. A slow, unrelenting reclamation of space, of voice, of self. There were no goodbyes to say, no final confrontation, no apology needed anymore, because silence, once her prison, had finally become her echo. And the world had heard it.